The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson. And today I am joined by a fellow podcaster and friend, Carol Ann Lloyd. Carol, welcome.
Thank you. It is so great to be here. I really appreciate you reaching out and having me on.
Well, we're going to talk about a fun topic today because you have a new book out, right? It's called Courting the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth and her Suitors. What a fun topic.
So fun because it really allowed me to sort of peel back some of the top layers we see about the Virgin Queen, see what was going on at court, in her life, across the world with some of the different women and men who were around her.
You know, looking at your book, one of the first things that came to mind to me was the influences on Elizabeth when it came to marriage. Not only did she have her father's lifestyle to look at, she also had the female influences of her sister and Mary, Queen of Scots. I'm curious, how much do you think that influenced her decision making?
I do think it influenced her. And I know this is one of those topics that not all historians agree about. And so I'm very respectful of other interpretations as we all look at some of this same material. But I do believe that as Elizabeth, who was very strategic, very pragmatic, looked around her, she saw women who were married and it didn't always work in their favor. So even though her sister, half sister Mary the First, had a really carefully contract, it was so carefully cast and so creatively written. It was not a typical marital contract between two monarchs because Mary needed to retain the ruling power in England. Yeah. And the marriage contract specified that. So that although Philip was King of England, he could not himself introduce laws into Parliament. He had to defer to her on things in England. He could not sort of go rogue. And he also could not take Mary out of England. She remained in England. He came and went. Even so, when he needed something, when he came back and he needed troops and he needed money for his war with France, he got it because the way marriage was viewed was that the man was in charge. Even if you're the queen, that's according to religion, according to society, according to law, the man takes precedence. And so I think she saw that. And in the case of Mary, Queen of Scots, who apparently had a very good first marriage with the French Dauphin and then king. I think they really loved each other. After that, Mary, Queen of Scots made sort of a series of bad choices. And not only was Darnley not a great husband, I think we can just all agree, not a great husband.
Right.
But once Mary, Queen of Scots had a son, that son became a rival for her throne. And pretty soon she's thrown out so that young baby James can in fact become king as an infant because the male is preferable to the female.
Yeah.
So those are not great stories to encourage Elizabeth to get married, certainly.
Yeah. You know, and Mary Queen of Scots' story is a little bit different because she lived in France. She wasn't in Scotland in her youth when she was queen. So that changes things a little bit. But I feel like for Elizabeth, it would have been so difficult for her to marry a foreign, I don't even want to say a foreign prince, a foreign king, because how difficult would it be to be married to somebody who's ruling another country, just like Mary and Philip? How logistically, how are you supposed to make something like that work?
Right. And that was very difficult for Mary and Philip. Now, there were things that they were happy about. Catholic Europe was thrilled with that marriage, Mary and Philip. Philip did take specific steps to move England back into the Catholic fold, and Mary was all for that. But in terms of it really working as a marriage, you're right. His priority is Spain. Her priority is England. And even with that shared Catholic goal, and that was one of the challenges Elizabeth faced, most of Europe was Catholic. Most of her options were Catholic. So there would be no shared religious goal. So
Yeah.
all kinds of differences and challenges.
I'm glad that you brought up religion, because that was one of the things I really gathered from your book, was what a large piece of the negotiation process religion was, wasn't it?
Yes. So Elizabeth represented, because she didn't have any heirs, sort of the embodiment of the survival of the Protestant, which doesn't mean the same thing as Protestant today, or Anglican or evangelical or Elizabethan or whatever you want to call her religion. And she is it. And Catholic Europe had various princes and dukes and archdukes and kings who were interested in marrying her, but religion was often a big tripping point, because they either wanted her to become Catholic, which she did not want. In some cases, there was a possibility of, okay, we'll compromise. Elizabeth will remain Protestant. The new husband will be Catholic, and he can practice his Catholicism in private. He can have mass in private. He can go to Catholic services in private. But Elizabeth's Protestant ministers were saying, but that's illegal for the rest of the country. How can the king be allowed to do something that's illegal for the rest of the country without it sort of causing Catholics to rise up and saying, now's our chance?
Yeah.
So serious.
Was it, I'm trying to remember from your book, was it Philip II, when there was marriage discussion with him, that she called herself a heretic?
Yeah. So at the end, so this was a really, people kind of can't believe Philip would really propose in seriousness to Elizabeth, having been married to Mary. These two sisters are very different.
Yeah.
He seems to have, from his letters back and forth with the Count of Feria, who was his ambassador, and so those letters were pretty candid between the two of them. He seems to have believed, and Feria, who knew Elizabeth pretty well, certainly seemed to believe that Elizabeth would jump at the chance to marry him. And they kind of couldn't believe when she was stalling and stalling. And eventually she does say, well, I can't marry him because in his eyes, I'm a Catholic. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm a heretic.
Yeah.
and it really caught them off guard, because she was kind of owning it. She wasn't glossing it over. She wasn't pretending. She was saying, here's how he sees me, and I'm not changing. I am a heretic.
Right. I've been excommunicated.
Yeah. and you believe that. I mean, I think Philip did believe, and Philip seemed to believe, certainly, that she would defer to him and that he could manage her. He really didn't know her at all. He believed that. But yes, she used religion to thwart some possibilities that otherwise could have moved forward when she was ready to really bring them to an end. So, yeah.
I'm curious, of all the foreign princes that she was looking at, were there any that seemed like they could have been a good match, or that maybe she was leaning toward them a little bit more?
There are a couple for different reasons. I don't know that she ever personally wanted to marry the Archduke Charles. He was from the Habsburg Empire. He was a Catholic. He was willing to marry her and not expect her to change religion, but he was also not willing to change religion. So there were certainly religious barriers to that. But when Mary, Queen of Scots, was representing a significant threat to Elizabeth, so Mary, Queen of Scots, is no longer Queen of France. Now she is in Scotland, and she is Catholic. And there are a possibility of all kinds of alliances before she marries Darnley. Really, if she had married into the Spanish royal family, if Mary, Queen of Scots, had married, and so now Spain has this landing place in Scotland, that does make Elizabeth vulnerable. And I think the Archduke Charles offered sort of a political backup to her and a way of saying, I am stronger than I appear because I have this behind me. Ultimately, it did not work, and she was not willing to make the concessions. But I think that was a possibility politically for a time. I don't know how possible, but I think that was a possibility. The one that I think in terms of foreign that was a personal possibility was much later in her reign, and this is the Duke of Anjou, or her frog, which, although that doesn't sound like a complimentary nickname to us, it was to her. For her to give a nickname, typically that was a sign of affection, just like we call each other pet names or whatever. Frog was a pet name. And she did seem to get along with him personally, although there was a huge age difference. She was much older. And in this time, which is not to say this is true at all today, but in this time, women in their 40s were not likely to have children. It was unusual for a woman, and this is true of Elizabeth's stepmothers as well. You know, as they get into their 30s, they typically stop having children. And so as she is in marriage negotiations in her late 30s and 40s, although her physician is saying, yes, she can have children, I don't know if anyone really believed that was possible because it was unlikely at the time. However, the Duke of Anjou left France and came to England to court her. He's the only foreign suitor that actually came to her. And she did like that. He was very flattering. He was very flamboyant. And I think there was a part of her that maybe wanted just a partner, just wanted someone to be there, someone to talk to. And it was during that courtship that she found out that Robert Dudley had married Lettice Knowles. And so even though she was not going to marry Dudley, she didn't really want him to marry somebody else. And so maybe at that moment, Anjou looked appealing as sort of a personal prospect, but ultimately it was not best for the country. She believed her council was very split. Walsingham in particular was very opposed to that marriage. And ultimately she did not marry him. But I think those two may have held some possibility in some ways.
One of the stories that I love when it comes to her suitors is Eric of Sweden, because he clearly had the hots for her and wanted more from her. And I love how he really wanted to come visit her. And she's like, whoa, whoa, no, no, no.
no. And religion was actually his main calling card because of all of these offers. He was Protestant. And he somehow thought that was enough. He wasn't wealthy. He didn't have a big army. He couldn't give her this military support or money. But boy, I'm a Protestant and I like her. And yes, she did have to send him a pretty direct letter saying, no, don't come visit. Because that was diplomatically, you know, that one of the reasons she always said she had to see someone in person is because finally that brings things to a halt. These kings, these princes are not going to come over on spec for her to look him over and see if she's interested. So if Eric of Sweden is willing to come, that's such a gesture on his part. She's going to have to be acting in good faith, and she wasn't. So
yeah, I feel bad for Elizabeth because there was no way of winning. And politically, it was the smart choice to pick a foreign prince, right? Because then you have an ally. But it made the most sense for her to pick a domestic partner, did it not?
In a lot of ways, because for England to be top priority to both of them, it had to be someone from England. You know, if it's someone from France or someone from Austria, their country will come first. And as the man, that puts England in second place. So yes, plus these were the people she knew. These were the people she knew if she got along with. She knew where they stood. She knew how they behaved. It wasn't a surprise. And in some ways, just like Mary, Queen of Scots, growing up in France and spending all those years getting to know Francois, that's one of the reasons that first marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots was so good, because she married her best friend. And if he hadn't died so young, that marriage could have lasted a really long time and been really successful because she married somebody she knew.
Yeah.
Those were the people Elizabeth had grown up with, the people in England. And that's really, I think, in a lot of ways, would have been the best choice for a really happy or productive or non-political marriage. And that is one thing. Her father, and you mentioned her father and his sort of, but he married women he knew. And although they didn't work out for various reasons, that's what he liked to do. It was a personal kind of thing. So, and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon actually was successful for years. And if she'd given him a son, he probably would have stayed married to Catherine of Aragon. He knew her so well.
Yeah. It's funny. I just was recently talking about Jane Seymour with somebody and wondered if, if Jane Seymour had lived, what would their marriage have looked like? Would he have grown tired of her? She gave him Edward VI, so that's what he wanted, right?
Right.
I don't want to digress on that subject, but anyway.
Yes.
But when it comes to the domestic people, we know, of course, the number one on her list was always Robert Dudley, wasn't it?
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. She had in a lot of ways grown up with him. They had likely known each other as children because they both would have been at court. Certainly, they shared the experience during Mary I's reign of both being in the Tower of London. I don't think they met. There are all these novels that have them meeting secretly in the tower. That doesn't make sense. They were in the tower for treason. You don't get to have meetups of all the treasonous, all the traitors meet up. No. But they shared the experience and survived it. And that's a pretty small group of people who were sent to the tower and then get out alive. So they had all these shared experiences and they knew each other so well. So yes, I think he was definitely her BFF, and in some ways was the one she wanted.
Yeah, but the one she seems to never have been able to have. Isn't that the truth?
Yes. And I think it comes down to, first he's married, and that's a problem. And then Amy Robsart dies in this mysterious way. And there is scandal attached because she is found at the bottom of a short flight of stairs, having sent all of her servants out of the house, which is unheard of. To be home alone, a woman of that status, unheard of. She's alone. Now she's at the bottom of the stairs with her neck broken. I mean, it's just scandalous. And even though Robert Dudley is cleared, quote, quote, of any involvement, the scandal remains. And Elizabeth is never going to go there with a scandal.
It's so heartbreaking, isn't it? I feel so bad for her because it does seem like Robert Dudley would have been her choice, no question. And then the Amy Robsart thing happens and she's in this situation where she's like, well, what do I do now? Here we have this big scandal. I can't possibly marry him. How impossible for her to then try and figure out what to do with her life, what choices she should make. She clearly still loves Robert Dudley and has this great affection for him. And he keeps trying, doesn't he? He is trying to win her and get her to propose to him. I mean, let's talk about the whole Kenilworth thing, right?
This is, if you want to have a really high bar for a proposal, this would be it, or at least one of them. So Elizabeth, we know, goes on progresses almost every summer. She always likes to do that. She likes to be seen, and she likes to stay with her people, sometimes at crushing expense. And Robert Dudley decided to spare no expense in remaking his home at Kenilworth, remaking the gardens, building new buildings, just really having this magnificent stage. In a way, it really does become a stage for him to perform this lasting 19-day marriage proposal, and he hires leading playwrights and actors and musicians to have all of these events that promote marriage. Sometimes he goes a little too far, and the sort of knight in shining armor that races in to rescue the maiden in distress, that kind of a storyline is not necessarily what Elizabeth is looking for. She's not the maiden in distress. And she wants to be sort of the one who rescues. She wants to be the star of the show. Dudley doesn't always make her the star of the show. But another thing he does that doesn't get quite as much attention, I don't think, is that he commissions paired portraits of himself and the Queen. He has a huge portrait collection. In fact, it's been said that no one commissions more portraits of himself than Robert Dudley, other than the monarch. He really likes to have portraits of himself around. But in this case, for this event, they're very special portraits that are paired with him and the Queen. Now, they are not looking at each other because that really is reserved for husband and wife, but they are painted in similar clothing, in similar poses, and they are hung together at his home, where this huge number of people will see them that way. So the message is really clear. This progress is attended by thousands. Many of the events are made public, so people from nearby towns are coming and seeing him enact these glorious unions, ultimately, between a beloved virgin and some kind of knight in shining armor. So the message is pretty clear, and it goes on for a long time.
And he still doesn't get what he wants in the end.
And he still doesn't get what he wants in the end. And he too, so by this time, another part of this story that is interesting, Robert Dudley comes from a very famous, powerful family who have typically run afoul of the monarch. I mean, they're so close to power, and then something goes wrong. So we have this in the reign of Henry VII, when Dudley is one of his key ministers. But by the end of his reign, Henry VII is really enacting some pressure on the nobility that goes beyond what's legally allowed. And when Henry VIII comes to the throne, he doesn't really take on his father directly. After all, his father is the reason he's on the throne. But he gets his two ministers, Empson and Dudley, and they are executed for treason. So that's one, generation of the Dudleys. Then, of course, there's John Dudley, who rises right back up through the Tudor ranks and becomes Edward VI's right-hand man. I mean, helping Edward run the country. And in fact, he is the one that helps attempt to enact Edward's device for the succession to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, right? When Mary I takes the throne, there's John Dudley. So the whole Dudley family's in the Tower. John Dudley's executed. Later, during the Wyatt Rebellion, Guilford Dudley is executed. Some of the other Dudley brothers die fighting, and there are no Dudley heirs. And so Robert Dudley knows that he is, and he writes about himself as the last of our house. So the dynasty will end if he doesn't have a son. So he is also feeling the clock ticking, so to speak. Yeah. He wants a son. And part of that Kenilworth thing is him saying, if it's not going to be me and you, it's going to have to be me and someone else. Now, he doesn't actually say that, and Elizabeth certainly doesn't realize that.
Yeah.
But it is after that he pretty quickly marries Lettice Knowles. And they do have a son, tragically dies young. But that really is Robert Dudley's final appeal to Elizabeth, because he too really believes he wants to leave an heir. The focus is always on Elizabeth's heir, but Dudley also wants an heir.
Yeah, I think that was probably an outlook in your book that kind of surprised me a little bit, because I hadn't thought about that aspect of their relationship, that he also had a legacy that he wanted to maintain. He wanted to carry on that Dudley name.
Yes.
And he wanted to do it with the Queen, obviously.
Yes. That's quite a legacy.
Well, right. And then, of course, I'm sure you know of the speculation that they did have a son together, that Arthur Dudley. What's your take on that whole thing?
So first of all, I don't believe it. So I'll start with that. And I know there are people who do, but in all of my study of Elizabeth and her court and the impact of the bright, hot spotlight she was under from Catholic Europe, who were looking for any reason to get her off the throne. And we know there were spies in the court. And I do not think she could have hidden a pregnancy. I don't think she could have hidden an affair. I certainly don't think she could have hidden a pregnancy. There were too many people around her all the time. There were too many people in the pay of the Spanish or the Pope's court. I mean, there was a lot of money being paid to get dirt on Elizabeth. And if she had had a child, she would not have been able to keep her throne. And so I don't believe it. I also don't believe that she had massive affairs and lots of children. I mean, I know these stories are out there, but the reality of the Elizabethan court was such that she could not have kept it hidden and she would have lost her throne.
I don't know how I feel about it, honestly. I always think anything is possible, right? Unless we have evidence one way or another, anything is possible, but who knows? Maybe someday some evidence will come out.
That's right. And really, it's hard to prove a negative, right? So I'm saying, what I can document is how many spies are in the court. I don't think they would have missed it. So that's my take on it. That's my interpretation. Yeah. But you're right. Who knows? Who knows?
Well, now I'm going to bring up a subject that I really didn't want to bring up, but I kind of have to. And I think you probably know where I'm going to go with this, because let's go back to the younger years of Elizabeth and what her prospects looked like at that time, because obviously she was young when her mother was executed.
Yes.
She was made a bastard. And so her marriage prospects pretty much fell flat for quite some time. Do you recall who her first marriage prospect was?
Well, the very first was during Anne Boleyn's time in favor. So while Elizabeth was an infant, and this is actually the only marriage negotiation that was conducted while she was considered a legitimate heir, because she was made illegitimate before she turned 3. And Henry never reversed that. So technically from then on. But before that happens, while Anne Boleyn is still in favor and she is still considered a legitimate child of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, and at that point, the heir to the throne. Everyone believed Anne Boleyn would have a son and she would no longer be the heir. But there's a marriage negotiation while she's an infant with a child of Francois I. And at that time, England and France were very close. Anne Boleyn was very close to the French and really was for this. And that negotiation doesn't go through, but that is the negotiation. That's the first one we have any record of. And that is the only one that is conducted with her as a legitimate princess while she's a baby.
Isn't that crazy?
Isn't that amazing? So there is no stain of illegitimacy, which honestly does follow her throughout her reign. Even while she's queen, people bring up that she's illegitimate. It's one of the tools the Catholics can use to say she doesn't deserve to be on the throne. So before she's 3 is the only time that she really has. Of course, she's a baby. She doesn't even know it, but that's the only marriage negotiation while she's considered legitimate. So it doesn't have that complication.
Yeah. Yeah.
Crazy.
It is. But and then of course, without talking about all the scandal associated with Thomas Seymour, let's just even look at what happened after Catherine Parr died, because I do believe he did look to marry her after Parr died to maintain his status.
Yes. And actually, it would have been a good marriage for her as well. So at that time, Edward is alive. Edward is healthy. Everyone expects Edward to have children, to live a good long life, and then for his son to take on the throne and Elizabeth and Mary just to kind of be on the sidelines. She is still illegitimate. She is, however, in favor in Edward's court because she has the same religion. Now, there have been some scandals and she was under some investigation later, but in this moment, she is the same religion as Edward. She is in favor, therefore, because religion's very important to Edward, but she's not expected to become queen. So to marry a nobleman like Thomas Seymour would keep her in England, which would be a benefit for her because even at this point, most of Europe is Catholic. And so she would be able to keep her religion. She would be able to stay in England with her people, with people she knew, with all those kinds of things. Right.
Yeah.
So that is for her a possibility. And I think for Thomas Seymour, it gives him access, although his brother is trying to push him as far away as possible. But if he is married to the king's sweet sister Temperance, if he is married to Elizabeth, he would continue to have access to Edward VI. So I think for both of them, it could have been a good thing. The problem was that Edward Seymour didn't want it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Edward, that guy.
And I think, honestly, I think you can put that down to a lot of things and not necessarily good things, right? I mean, he wanted his brother far away. He was jealous. He was, Elizabeth had stood up to him in some ways and represented a strong voice. And I'm not sure Edward was real happy with that either. Elizabeth had been close to Catherine Parr. Edward and his wife had big problems with Catherine Parr. I mean, there were just a lot of personal and not for the good of the country reasons, I think, that Edward was against that marriage.
I feel like Edward Seymour was not as liked by his family as he wished he had. I mean, when I just recently talked to Elizabeth Norton about this and how his own mother snubbed him in her will, and his sister Jane snubbed him too. I think that speaks volumes to his relationship with his own family. And I've always felt like maybe he tried to be a good brother to Thomas, but his own ambitions and selfishness is what got in his way and in the way of Thomas's own happiness. Now, I will say Thomas was a bit reckless. He did make some choices that probably weren't the wisest, and going after Elizabeth kind of behind the scenes, like he did with Catherine Parr, was not a good move on his part. But I do think he thought, well, my brother's never going to agree to it. So one way or another, I have to try and make this happen. And I think he was a good choice for Elizabeth. I mean, he was the uncle of the king. Mm-hmm. She was of royal blood. He had just been married to a dowager queen. It made sense. It was kind of a sideways step for him. It wasn't going down. It was equal level, equal footing, I think. But yeah, those Seymours.
Yes. And it does seem that the infighting in the two brothers spilled out into a lot of other people's lives, quite frankly. But yeah, it seems personal in a lot of ways between Edward and Thomas. And as you say, other members of the family. And we know that Edward Seymour was not popular among the council either as time went on. There's a reason he fell so easily when John Dudley started making some noise. So yeah, that could have been a really good marriage for her because her future looked like she would be married off to somebody. And this would give her an English marriage, a Protestant marriage, staying with her family. She was close to Edward. So this seems like it would have been good for both of them.
Yeah, it probably would have been good for England as well, you would think or hope.
Yes.
I mean, there was quite an age difference between the two as well. So, that wasn't uncommon in Tudor times. And the fact, that that Thomas Seymour at that time just had the one child and it was a daughter. I'm sure he was looking for a son and an heir that way as well to compete with his brother.
Yes. And that would have, again, continuing his house would have been very important to him. And having a noble / royal wife to do that would have served him well. Right.
Yeah.
And, going forward.
Yeah.
So,
oh, Carol Ann, I love this topic. Of course, I could talk about Thomas Seymour all day, every day. That wasn't what we were here to discuss today because, we talked about Queen Elizabeth I or just Elizabeth Tudor in general and the possibilities of marriage within her lifetime. There were so many people that we didn't even cover today, but I do want to leave those for the readers because we don't want to give them all of the information now, do we?
No. There are people in there.
Yes. And some of them you've heard of before. Some of them you may have not heard of before. But if somebody would love to get their hands on your book, where could they find it?
So it is available right now in the UK. I have Pen and Sword Publisher. It's a UK publisher. And so you can order from them. I did check yesterday, and Amazon.co.uk also has it in the UK. It is scheduled to be published the end of August in the US. So it will be available from Amazon in the US and other of those sources the end of August.
Perfect. Well, Carol Ann, thank you so much for coming on the show today and talking about this with me.
Thank you for having me. It has been a delight, as always.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. If you love the show and would like to show your support, please head on over to my Patreon page. That's Patreon, patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty for more information. Over there, you're going to find commercial-free episodes. You'll get early access, and there's some exclusive content as well, with more stuff to come as I'm rebuilding it. Also, recently I returned from England and cannot wait to go back. But this time I would love to bring you with me. So if you're interested to go on a tour of England with me, why don't you send me an email, Rebecca@tudorsdynasty.com for more information. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.